The wind off the Chesapeake Bay carried more than a chill that autumn of 1984. It carried whispers that seemed to slide through the pine trees and crawl across the empty streets of Virginia's tidewater towns. Locals said the air felt different that year, heavier somehow, like it knew something terrible that the people didn't. The first disappearance had happened on a cool Friday night in early October. A young waitress named Lisa Hammond had clocked out of a small diner off Route 58 just before midnight. She was tired but cheerful, chatting with a coworker about saving up for nursing school. She waved goodbye, stepped into her old Ford Pinto, and drove off into the fog. By morning, her car was found on the shoulder of a rural road. Engine still warm, driver's door slightly open, purse inside. Lisa was gone. At first, police believed she'd run away. It was easier to think she'd left voluntarily than to believe something darker had unfolded. But Lisa's mother insisted she wasn't the kind to vanish. She'd been close to her family, loved her job, had plans. When days turned into weeks with no sign of her, the tone of the investigation shifted. Flyers went up in every shop window. Volunteers trudged through muddy fields and dense woods, shouting her name into the cold air. Dogs caught faint traces of her scent near the edge of the Great Dismal Swamp, but the trail faded into nothing. The story dominated the local news for a month, then quietly disappeared from headlines. Just another mystery that life seemed unwilling to explain. 3 months later, on a night just as cold and just as foggy, another young woman disappeared. Her name was Caroline Price, a 22-year-old college student from Norfolk. She'd been at a small off-campus gathering, said goodnight to her friends around 11, and never made it home. The next morning, her blue Toyota Corolla was discovered in nearly the same condition as Lisa Hammond's car. Engine idling, door ajar, keys still dangling in the ignition. Inside were her textbooks and a cassette still playing on the radio. Her shoes were in the back seat, as if she had been interrupted while getting comfortable for a long drive. The similarities between the two cases were impossible to ignore, but authorities were hesitant to connect them. It was the 1980s, long before databases linked jurisdictions and communication between police departments was slower, often tangled in ego and red tape. Each agency wanted to believe it could solve its own mystery. But in living rooms across Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, and Norfolk, people had already drawn their own conclusions. They whispered that something evil was moving through the region, something that didn't care about county lines or city borders. Parents began setting curfews again. Girls who once drove home from late shifts without a second thought now called brothers or boyfriends to follow behind them. Gas station attendants reported seeing women glancing nervously over their shoulders while filling up their cars. Even small acts, locking the doors, checking the back seat, became rituals of quiet fear. A detective named John Avery from Chesapeake's homicide unit couldn't shake the feeling that these cases were connected. He'd worked enough missing persons to know when a pattern was forming. Late one night, he spread both case files across his desk, cigarette smoke curling into the air as he studied the black and white photographs. Lisa Hammond smiling in her waitress uniform. Caroline Price posing by the beach, sunlight catching her hair. 2 lives cut short. 2 sets of footprints that vanished into the Virginia fog. Avery made notes in the margins. Same age range, same time of night, both near major roads with access to isolated wooded areas. He leaned back in his chair, rubbed his temples, and muttered to himself, "Someone's hunting them." Weeks passed, then months. Search teams continued combing through fields, rivers, and abandoned lots. The woods near the Dismal Swamp became a graveyard of cigarette butts, coffee cups, and false hope. Each time they thought they'd found something, a torn piece of fabric, a shallow depression in the soil, it led nowhere. But fear once planted doesn't fade easily. Local newspapers ran a string of stories titled The Route 58 Mystery, complete with speculative sketches and maps. People began describing strange vehicles seen at night, An old brown pickup truck, a white van, a man with a flashlight standing near the roadside at midnight. Most reports turned out to be nothing, but the stories added to the legend. In December, a hunter discovered a single shoe in a ditch near Lake Drummond, not far from where Lisa's scent trail had ended. It was mud-stained, size 7, and later identified by her mother as belonging to Lisa. Searchers flooded the area, trudging through thick reeds and black water, but found nothing else. When the search ended, the only sound left was the wind rattling the cattails. Winter bled into spring, and the case grew colder with each passing day. Detectives were transferred, priorities shifted, and the public's attention drifted elsewhere. Yet for the families of Lisa and Caroline, time stood still. Lisa's mother kept her bedroom exactly as she'd left it. The blanket folded neatly, her favorite paperback still open on the nightstand. Caroline's father drove the same stretch of road every Sunday, hoping to spot something everyone else had missed. Grief had turned into a routine of quiet persistence. In 1985, when another woman went missing in nearby Suffolk, the whispers reignited. Her name was Denise Crawford, and her case mirrored the others almost perfectly. Late night, isolated road, abandoned vehicle. But this time, police found something they hadn't before. A partial footprint in the mud beside the car. It was too faint for clear analysis, but it was proof that someone had been there. Someone who left behind just enough to haunt them. Detective Avery pressed harder to connect the cases officially, but superiors dismissed the idea. Without solid evidence, it was speculation. Still, he couldn't let go. He visited the families, studied maps, even consulted a profiler from the FBI who told him the killer likely lived nearby, perhaps within 20 miles of the victims. He knows the area, the profiler said. He's comfortable here. That's why he keeps coming back. As 1986 arrived, the region's sense of unease deepened. Newspaper clippings about the disappearances yellowed with age, but people still remembered the names. The old diner where Lisa had worked closed down, its windows boarded and sign faded, but locals driving past swore they could still see her face reflected in the glass on foggy mornings. Rumors of sightings surfaced every few months. Someone claimed to have seen Caroline at a gas station in North Carolina. Another said Denise had been spotted in a truck stop diner, but none of it was ever verified. By the end of the decade, the cases had officially gone cold. But in the quiet moments, when the wind moved through the trees or when headlights flickered across an empty back road, there was still that feeling, that echo of something unfinished. The people who'd lived through those years carried it with them, a story half told, a shadow that refused to fade, and though no one could prove it, many believed the same thing. That somewhere out there, the person responsible for the 1984 and 1985 disappearances was still walking among them. Maybe he was the man pumping gas next to you. Maybe he was the neighbor waving good morning. Maybe he was someone you'd already met. Someone who'd smiled, shaken your hand, and gone home to a dark secret that had been buried deep beneath the calm surface of everyday life. The Chesapeake wind kept blowing, whispering through the pines, carrying the memory of 3 women who vanished into it. The stories would fade, names would blur with time, but the fear stayed. It lingered in the hearts of the families, and in the empty spaces between one small Virginia town and the next. Because in 1984, the night swallowed its victims whole, and the darkness never gave them back. By the time the calendar turned to 1987, the unease that had settled over southeastern Virginia had grown into something darker, an invisible fog of dread that hung over every late-night diner and lonely stretch of highway. It wasn't just the disappearances anymore, it was what came next. In March of that year, a pair of hunters stumbled upon what they first thought was animal remains deep inside a wooded area off an old service road near Chesapeake. But when they got closer, the truth stopped them cold. It was a human body, partially buried beneath a rotting layer of leaves. The remains were badly decomposed, but a small silver necklace with an engraved L confirmed what many had feared for nearly 3 years. It was Lisa Hammond. The discovery reopened every wound the community had tried to heal. Police swarmed the area, crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze like warning ribbons. Reporters gathered at the edge of the woods, their cameras pointed toward the trees. Forensic teams collected soil samples, fibers, and fragments of fabric. The medical examiner confirmed what no one wanted to hear. Lisa had been strangled. The condition of her remains suggested she had been killed soon after she disappeared. There were no signs of a struggle nearby. No weapon, no clear trace of who had left her there. Detective John Avery stood over the scene, his boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. He'd seen dozens of bodies in his career, but this one hit him differently. He remembered Lisa's mother from the first investigation, the way she'd pleaded with him to keep searching. He had promised her that he would. Now he felt that promise twisting in his chest. They had found Lisa, yes, but they hadn't found her peace. Whoever had done this was still out there, and Avery could feel it in his bones. They weren't finished. 2 months later, just as the Hammond case was formally reopened, another body was discovered, this time near a small lake on the outskirts of Norfolk. The victim was Caroline Price, the college student who had vanished in 1985. The similarities between the two cases were chilling. Both women had been strangled with what appeared to be a rope or cord. Both had been found in wooded, secluded areas within a 30-mile radius. Both had been left partially covered, as if their killer had cared enough to hide them but not enough to bury them fully. The forensic team noticed something else. Small traces of red fibers near both bodies, possibly from the same source. By June of 1987, what had once been separate investigations were now connected by undeniable evidence. The media caught wind of it almost immediately, and headlines screamed of a possible serial killer loose in Virginia. Residents who once dismissed the earlier fears began to lock their doors in daylight. Gas stations, rest stops, and motels along Route 58 started putting up "for employees only" signs after dark. And yet the fear didn't stop people from watching, from gossiping, from scanning every stranger's face for something sinister. Detective Avery and his team worked day and night. They interviewed hundreds of people, from long-haul truck drivers to local mechanics, construction workers, and drifters passing through. Every man with a criminal record in the region became a potential suspect. They followed one promising lead, a man who'd been seen near one of the victims' cars, but it collapsed when his alibi checked out. Another suspect, a truck driver with a history of violence, was ruled out after his DNA didn't match the evidence they had recovered. Though DNA testing in those days was primitive at best, still Avery's instincts told him something. The killer wasn't an outsider. He was local. Someone who knew these back roads like the lines on his own hands. Someone who understood how far you could drive before you stopped seeing porch lights and started seeing nothing but trees. In the summer of that same year, another woman went missing. Her name was Brenda Simmons, a 24-year-old receptionist from Virginia Beach. She was last seen leaving a bowling alley around midnight after a co-worker's birthday celebration. Her car, a dark green Mustang, was found the next morning parked neatly at the side of a quiet access road that ran parallel to Interstate 64. The driver's seat was pushed back slightly, the keys were in the ignition, and her purse was still on the passenger seat. The eerie familiarity of the scene made Avery's stomach twist. It was happening again. When Brenda's body was found 3 weeks later near a creek bed outside Suffolk, the similarities were impossible to deny. Rope marks around the neck, partial covering with leaves and branches, and once again those faint red fibers clinging to her clothing. It was the same killer. Avery was sure of it. But without fingerprints, witnesses, or technology capable of matching the fibers to a specific source, they were chasing a ghost. Meetings were held between departments from Norfolk, Chesapeake, Suffolk, and even Richmond. Detectives exchanged files and photos, theories and frustrations. One officer from Richmond suggested they consult the FBI's behavioral science unit, newly popularized by criminal profiling. Avery agreed. Within weeks, 2 agents arrived and reviewed the case files. Their conclusion was chilling. The killer, they said, was organized but confident. He selected victims who were alone, ensured minimal witnesses, and left behind almost nothing that could identify him. He was methodical, possibly working a blue-collar job that required travel. But one comment stood out above all. "He's enjoying this," one of the agents said. "He's watching the panic. He knows he's in control." The media frenzy that followed the FBI's involvement turned the Tidewater region into a pressure cooker. Talk shows speculated about the killer's identity. Newspaper articles printed side-by-side photos of the victims, calling him the Chesapeake Strangler. The police despised the nickname, but it stuck. People started seeing the so-called Strangler everywhere. At the grocery store, walking his dog, driving a van near the park. False reports flooded the police line daily. Every tip had to be checked, every rumor investigated, and still nothing concrete emerged. By late 1987, the task force was exhausted. Detectives were sleeping in their offices, and the pressure from both the media and the victims' families was crushing. Avery often found himself staring at the evidence boards late at night, the lines of red string connecting photos, maps, and timelines. Somewhere in that web was the truth, he told himself, but the killer had left only traces, like whispers caught between the trees. Then, just before Christmas, a farmer found something strange while clearing brush near his property in Isle of Wight County. A length of red industrial cord buried shallowly in the dirt. It was frayed at one end, stained dark. Forensic analysis revealed traces of human DNA on it, consistent with 2 of the victims. It was the first tangible link, but it led nowhere. The cord was a common type used in auto shops, warehouses, and farms. Thousands of people could have owned it. Avery felt as though he'd been given hope only to have it ripped away again. In early 1988, the killing stopped. No new victims appeared. No new cases matched the pattern. The fear didn't fade immediately, but over time people began to breathe again. The newspapers stopped running daily updates. The Chesapeake Strangler slipped quietly into the realm of memory. Some believed the killer had died. Others thought he had moved on to another state. A few wondered if he had simply decided to stop because the attention had become too intense. Detective Avery, though, couldn't let it go. He retired in 1993 but kept copies of every file, every photograph, every map. He visited the victims' graves each year on the anniversary of their disappearances, laying flowers and whispering the same quiet promise. "I'm not done yet." The killer might have vanished, but Avery knew in his gut that monsters like that didn't just stop. They waited. They watched. They learned how to disappear better than anyone else. The 1980s faded into history, but the shadow of those years remained. 3 young women, Lisa, Caroline, Brenda, and perhaps more who were never found, had lost their lives to a faceless predator who had walked among them unnoticed. Every small town along Virginia's coastal highways carried a piece of that fear, tucked quietly into memory. Mothers still told their daughters to be careful, to never drive alone at night, to lock their doors no matter how safe it felt. Because everyone knew that once, not too long ago, the darkness of Virginia's back roads had swallowed people whole, and it could do so again. It was almost 30 years later when the silence finally began to stir again. In 2019, inside the sterile halls of the Virginia Department of Forensic Science in Richmond, a young forensic analyst named Emily Carter sat surrounded by boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. Each one was labeled in fading ink: Chesapeake 1984, Norfolk 1985, Suffolk 1987. The cardboard had yellowed, the tape brittle with age. Most investigators had long stopped believing these cases would ever move forward, but Emily had a different kind of curiosity, the stubborn, almost defiant kind. She'd grown up in Virginia Beach hearing whispers about the unsolved murders of the 1980s. Her own mother had gone to school with one of the victims. To Emily, these weren't just cold cases. They were unfinished stories that deserved an ending. She slipped on her gloves, carefully opened one of the evidence boxes, and began cataloging each item. Inside were photographs, handwritten police notes, and sealed plastic bags containing fibers, soil samples, and the occasional small item: a button, a cigarette butt, a hair. At the very bottom of the box, she found a small envelope labeled swab, victim number 2. It had been stored properly all these years, but had never undergone modern testing. DNA analysis in the 1980s was primitive. By today's standards, it was almost useless. But genetic genealogy, one of the most powerful forensic tools of the new millennium, had changed everything. Emily decided this would be her starting point. When she placed the sample into the sequencing machine, she expected nothing. Cold cases rarely yielded miracles, but when the results came back 2 weeks later, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. There was a partial match. A distant relative, a cousin living in North Carolina, who had uploaded their DNA to a public genealogy database. The match wasn't close enough to identify the suspect directly, but it was enough to build a family tree. Emily called her supervisor, and soon a small team was assigned to assist her in what would become the largest genealogical investigation Virginia had ever seen. They spent months tracing connections, combing through census records, birth certificates, and family histories that stretched back generations. Each branch of the family narrowed the search, leading them closer and closer to one man, a quiet, middle-aged auto mechanic named Richard Nolan. He had lived in Chesapeake his entire life, just a few miles from where Lisa Hammond's car had been found. The strange thing was that Nolan had died in 2012 from a heart attack. He'd never been on the police radar. No criminal record, no violent history, no known connection to any of the victims. On the surface, he was ordinary, even forgettable. But his DNA was the match. When investigators compared Nolan's genetic profile to the evidence from multiple 1980s murder scenes, it lined up perfectly. The red fibers found on the victim's clothing traced back to the type of industrial cord used in automotive garages, the same kind Nolan had used daily in his shop. Tire tracks from the crime scenes matched the tread pattern of the truck model he drove during those years. Every unanswered question from the old case files began falling into place like puzzle pieces that had been waiting for decades. The realization hit the cold case unit like a thunderclap. They had their killer, but he was already dead. It was both victory and heartbreak. For years, detectives had chased a ghost, and now they'd finally found him, but justice would never see a courtroom. Emily Carter felt the weight of it more than anyone. She stared at Nolan's faded driver's license photo, his neutral expression, his tired eyes. How many times had people passed this man on the street, smiled politely, and never realized they were looking into the face of a predator? The team didn't stop there. They needed to know more. Why he did it, how he chose his victims, and whether there were more. They interviewed his surviving family, neighbors, and former co-workers. The portrait that emerged was chilling in its banality. Nolan had been quiet, hard-working, punctual. He kept mostly to himself, lived alone after his divorce, and spent weekends fishing or tinkering with cars. One co-worker described him as a man who could vanish without making a sound. He didn't drink, didn't argue, didn't stand out. But some remembered odd details. How he'd sometimes disappear for long drives at night. How he'd get irritated when women walked alone past the shop after dark, and how on more than one occasion he'd shown up at work with small scratches on his hands. Investigators discovered that during the 1980s, Nolan had worked at a garage less than a mile from where 2 of the victims' vehicles were found. He had access to the same kind of red industrial cord that had strangled them. His house, long since sold, was located along a series of back roads that led directly to all 3 known dump sites. The map that Detective Avery had drawn by hand decades earlier now seemed prophetic. Every location Avery had circled fell within a 20-minute drive of Nolan's home. When news of the discovery reached the surviving families, the reaction was a mixture of relief, disbelief, and quiet rage. Lisa Hammond's mother, now in her 70s, cried when she got the call. "I always knew he was out there," she said softly. "I just didn't know his name." Caroline Price's brother described it as finally being able to breathe after holding it in for 30 years. Yet there was also frustration. The man who had taken so much from them had escaped earthly justice. He'd lived out his life peacefully, unpunished, while they'd spent decades drowning in grief. Emily Carter and her team prepared a detailed report for the public announcement. It would be a major press conference, one that would close a chapter of Virginia's most haunting cold cases. Before the announcement, Emily sat in her office late at night, the city lights glowing faintly through the blinds. On her desk were the photos of the victims: Lisa, Caroline, Brenda. They had been young, full of promise, their lives cut short by a man who'd slipped through the cracks of time. Emily whispered to their photographs, "We found him. You can rest now." The next morning, the conference room at Chesapeake Police Headquarters was packed. Reporters filled every seat, cameras flashed, and the hum of whispered questions filled the air. At the front stood a small group of people, old and young detectives, forensic scientists, and families who had waited decades for this moment. Among them was John Avery, now in his late 70s, his once dark hair silver and his hands slightly trembling. He had come out of retirement for this single day. When the police chief finished the formal statement, Avery stepped forward, his voice steady despite the emotion burning in it. "For 30 years we asked the same questions," he said. "Who did this? Why? And would we ever find him? Today we have our answers. His name was Richard Nolan. He's no longer alive to face trial, but we know the truth now. And sometimes that has to be enough." Flashbulbs went off like fireworks as reporters shouted questions. One asked if the case was officially closed. Avery paused before answering. "Closed," he said, "but not forgotten. Because every time we open one of these boxes, every time science catches up with evil, we prove that the past doesn't stay buried forever." Outside the building, the air felt lighter, as if the city itself had exhaled. Families embraced. Reporters filed stories that would go live within hours. And somewhere across the quiet neighborhoods of Chesapeake and Norfolk, people who'd grown up with the fear of the 1980s murders finally felt the weight begin to lift. That night, Emily returned to her office one last time. She looked again at Nolan's photo. She tried to imagine him in those dark woods, his breath visible in the cold, the moonlight glinting off the rope in his hands. She tried to imagine what went through his mind, if he'd ever felt guilt, if he'd ever looked into the mirror and seen the monster everyone else had missed. She would never know. But she did know this. Science had spoken for the dead. DNA had become the voice that time could not silence. As she turned off the lights, the hum of the machine still running in the lab behind her seemed almost alive, like the heartbeat of justice itself. Somewhere inside those machines lay the next clue, the next ghost waiting to be named. The dead no longer stayed silent in Virginia. The tide had turned, and for the first time in 30 years, the truth had finally come to shore. The morning of the announcement felt strangely still, as if Virginia itself was holding its breath. Word had spread quickly through Chesapeake, Norfolk, and the small towns that had lived under the shadow of those unsolved killings for decades. Reporters lined up outside the police headquarters before dawn, their breath visible in the cold. Inside, families of the victims waited quietly in a large room filled with folding chairs and framed photos of the young women who had vanished so many years before. There was a low hum of nervous whispers, the sound of tissues being pulled from purses, the occasional sigh from someone trying to steady themselves for what they were about to hear. Detective John Avery sat in the front row, a cane propped beside him, his once broad shoulders slightly stooped with age. But his eyes, sharp, watchful, The same eyes that had studied those crime scene photos for half his life still burned with that old fire. He'd chased this ghost for 3 decades. Every late night in his office, every dead end, every sleepless hour haunted by the faces of women he'd promised to bring justice for, had led to this moment. He didn't need to speak to anyone. The look in his eyes said enough. He was finally going to keep his promise. When the police chief stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. Behind him stood a display board with the photos of the 3 victims: Lisa Hammond, Caroline Price, and Brenda Simmons, and a 4th photograph newly added that morning, the faded driver's license image of Richard Nolan. The chief took a slow breath and began to read. His voice was steady, but each word carried the weight of decades. After 35 years, the Chesapeake Cold Case Task Force, in cooperation with the Virginia Department of Forensic Science, has successfully identified the individual responsible for the series of homicides that occurred between 1984 and 1987. The suspect, Richard Nolan, a Chesapeake resident and former auto mechanic, is now confirmed through forensic genealogy to be the perpetrator. The room gasped softly. Even though the families had been informed privately before the press conference, hearing the name spoken publicly felt different, final, real, inescapable. Some of the mothers and siblings began to cry quietly, the sound muffled but heavy. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts. The chief continued explaining how DNA preserved from the original evidence had finally led them to Nolan, how technological advances had made it possible to identify him decades after his death. When the chief stepped aside, Avery rose from his seat, gripping the edge of the podium for balance. His voice, though raspy with age, carried through the room with quiet authority. "When I started on this case," he said, "we didn't have the tools we have today. We had maps, shoe prints, and our instincts. But what we didn't have was time. And that's what this man stole from us. The time those girls should have had. The years their families lost waiting for answers." He looked out across the room, his eyes glistening. "But I want you all to know this: time didn't win. The truth never stays buried forever." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was powerful. A mix of grief, relief, and reverence for the long fight that had finally reached its end. After the conference, reporters surrounded the families, asking how they felt. Lisa Hammond's mother, now frail but sharp-eyed, held a framed photo of her daughter close to her chest. "It doesn't bring her back," she said softly, "but it brings her peace. That's all I ever wanted, for her to rest." Caroline Price's brother spoke next, his voice trembling. "He lived his life. He had holidays, birthdays, Sundays. My sister didn't, but knowing who did it, that changes something. It closes a door that's been open too long." As the crowd began to disperse, Avery stood near the window, watching the reporters pack up their gear. He could see the reflection of the victims' photos behind him in the glass. 3 smiling young women frozen in time. He whispered something to them, barely audible. "You can rest now." For him, the end wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, reflective, a moment to let go of a weight that had nearly defined his life. Later that evening, the story hit every news channel across the state. Virginia cold case breakthrough. 1980s serial killer identified through DNA. People who had been children when the killings occurred watched in disbelief. Social media filled with comments from locals remembering the fear that had gripped their towns. Some swore they'd seen Nolan before, that he'd once fixed their cars or stood in line behind them at the grocery store. The ordinariness of him was what terrified everyone the most. He had been no monster from the shadows, no stranger lurking in alleys. He had been one of them, living quietly among the people he'd once hunted. In the following weeks, more pieces of Nolan's life came to light. Journalists dug through archives, interviewing old co-workers and neighbors. One neighbor remembered that in the mid-1980s, Nolan used to keep his garage lights on well past midnight. the sound of metal tools echoing faintly into the night. Another recalled seeing him burn something behind his property, though no one had thought much of it at the time. His ex-wife, living in another state, refused to comment publicly, but confirmed that during their brief marriage he often left for night drives with no explanation. The image of the quiet, hard-working mechanic began to unravel, revealing a man who had carried his darkness in silence. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were finally able to hold proper memorials. They gathered by the waterfront near Chesapeake Bay, where the wind carried the sound of waves against the rocks. Small paper lanterns were released into the sky, each one glowing softly as it drifted upward. The air was cold, but there was warmth in the shared grief and healing. As the lanterns rose higher, Lisa's mother looked up and whispered, "You can go now, baby. You're free." The lanterns faded into the night like distant stars, and for the first time in decades there was a sense of closure. For Emily Carter, the young forensic analyst who had reopened the case, the experience changed everything. The night after the announcement, she sat alone in her lab, the hum of the machine still in the background. She ran her fingers along the edges of the old evidence box one last time, before sealing it shut again. It felt symbolic, like closing a story that had been waiting for its ending far too long. She thought of all the other boxes in the archives, hundreds of them, each one holding another unsolved story, another set of unanswered questions. She realized that what they had done wasn't just about one case. It was proof that justice could reach through time, that even after decades, science and persistence could speak for the silenced. Months later, the story of the Chesapeake murders became part of a statewide cold case initiative. The Virginia Department of Forensic Science received new funding to test DNA from hundreds of old cases. Emily was put in charge of a new team. Detective Avery, now fully retired, came by to visit occasionally, sitting in her office and telling her stories about the old days, the long nights, the false leads, the moments when he'd almost given up. "You did what we couldn't," he told her one afternoon. "You brought the light where we only had guesses." She smiled at him. "You kept the story alive," she said. "If you hadn't believed, there wouldn't have been anything left to find." Avery nodded, looking out the window at the evening sky. "You know," he said softly, "people think time buries everything, but time doesn't bury the truth. It just hides it until someone brave enough comes looking." When he left the building that evening, the sun was setting behind the skyline of Richmond, painting the sky in orange and gold. He paused for a moment, looking toward the horizon. He thought about Lisa, Caroline, Brenda, all those years lost, all the pain their families had endured. And then he thought about the peace they had finally found. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something pure, something honest. The truth, even delayed, still had power. And so the story of the Virginia cold cases closed with a strange kind of beauty. A story that began with fear, silence, and mystery ended with light, truth, and remembrance. The killer had vanished into death, but his exposure had freed the living. Across Virginia, people slept a little easier, knowing that even the deepest shadows could eventually be pierced. The wind still moved through the pines, whispering through the same roads and fields that had once been drenched in fear. But now those whispers carried something different. Not dread, but peace. The past had finally spoken, and for once it had spoken loud enough for everyone to hear.